Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 3 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 3. Question number 80. A synchronous Lambda-based checkout service connects to an RDS for MySQL database. Traffic spike produces too many connections errors even though the database still has available CPU and memory. The application must continue returning confirmations immediately, which change addresses the connection search. Option A. Reuse a database client initialized outside the handler and connect through Amazon RDS proxy. Option B. Increase max_user_ connections, initialize the client outside the handler, and restart the database. Option C. Put requests in an SQS FIFO queue and set Lambda concurrency equal to the database's connection limit. Option D. Put requests in an SQS FIFO queue and set Lambda concurrency below the database's connection limit. The correct answer is A. Reuse a database client initialized outside the handler and connect through Amazon RDS proxy. Here is why. Reusing the client reduces repeated setup, while RDS proxy pools and shares database connections across bursty Lambda invocations. Why are the other options not correct? B. Raising the connection limit can increase database pressure and requires parameter changes and a restart. C. Asynchronous queuing conflicts with the immediate response requirement and equality to the connection limit leaves no safety margin. D. Queuing can regulate writes but changes the synchronous checkout behavior. Exam tip. Use RDS proxy to pool connections for highly concurrent Lambda applications that access relational databases. Question number 81. A company suspects that credit card numbers are present in data files across several S3 buckets. A developer must run a managed sensitive data discovery job and identify findings, specifically associated with financial information. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Query the buckets with Athena and filter for sensitive data, S3 object/personal findings. Option B. Run an Athena job and filter for sensitive data, S3 object/financial findings. Option C. Run an Amazon May-C discovery job and filter for sensitive data, S3 object/personal findings. Option D. Run an Amazon May-C discovery job and filter for sensitive data, S3 object/financial findings. The correct answer is D. Run an Amazon May-C discovery job and filter for sensitive data, S3 object/financial findings. Here is why. May-C inspects supported S3 objects for sensitive data, and the financial finding type includes data such as credit card and bank account numbers. Why are the other options not correct? A. Athena does not generate May-C finding types, and personal is not the financial category. B. Athena queries data but does not create sensitive data, S3 object findings. C. Personal findings cover PII or PHI rather than credit card data classified as financial. Exam tip. Use May-C for managed S3 sensitive data discovery and select the finding category that matches the data type. Question number 82. A media application allows anonymous visitors to preview sample assets. Registered users can access the full catalog. The application must issue temporary AWS credentials to both guest and signed-in identities and retain an identity relationship when a guest later authenticates. Which two configurations meet these requirements? Choose two. Option A. Use a Cognito user pool configured to issue AWS credentials directly to anonymous users. Option B. Create a Cognito identity pool that permits unauthenticated identities and exchanges identity information for temporary AWS credentials. Option C. Use a CloudFront distribution to create identities and exchange viewer tokens for AWS credentials. Option D. Give all users unrestricted sample content access and create only an authenticated role for the remaining content. E. Configure separate IAM roles. An unauthenticated role limited to sample assets and an authenticated role permitted to access the full catalog. correct answer is B. Create a cognito identity pool that permits unauthenticated identities and exchanges identity information for temporary AWS credentials. E. Configure separate IAM roles. An unauthenticated role limited to sample assets and an authenticated role permitted to access the full catalog. Here is why. The identity pool supports guest and signed-in identities and issues temporary credentials. Separate IAM roles enforce different permissions for sample and full content. Why are the other options not correct? User pools authenticate users but do not directly provide guest AWS credentials. C. CloudFront is not an identity pool or AWS credential broker. D. Default public access does not provide the required identity-based guest tracking and role separation. Exam tip. Use cognito identity pools with authenticated and unauthenticated IAM roles when both guests and signed-in users need AWS resource access. Question number 83. A company is replacing an EC2 application tier with Lambda functions. The functions must connect to an RDS for MySQL instance in private VPC subnets. The functions therefore need permissions to create and manage the network interfaces used for VPC attachment, and the database must accept traffic from them. Which configuration meets these requirements? Option A. Attach AWS Lambda Basic Execution Role, keep the functions outside the VPC, and create a Lambda interface endpoint. Option B. Attach AWS Lambda Basic Execution Role, place the functions in the VPC, and allow their security group in the RDS security group. Option C. Attach AWS Lambda VPC Access Execution Role, place the functions in the VPC, and allow the Lambda security group on the database port in the RDS security group. Option D. Attach AWS Lambda VPC Access Execution Role, keep the functions outside the VPC, and create an interface endpoint that permits Lambda invoke function. The correct answer is C. Attach AWS Lambda VPC Access Execution Role, place the functions in the VPC, and allow the Lambda security group on the database port in the RDS security group. Here is why. The managed policy supplies network interface permissions for VPC attachment, and the security group rule permits private database connectivity. Why are the other options not correct? Basic execution role does not include the EC2 network interface permissions needed for Lambda VPC attachment. B. The networking permissions are incomplete even though the security group direction is correct. D. A Lambda API interface endpoint supports invoking Lambda privately. It does not connect function code to RDS. Exam tip. Lambda VPC access requires ENI permissions, subnet and security group configuration, and database-side ingress. Question number 84. A CloudFormation template launches EC2 instances from a custom AMI in US East 1. The same template fails in US West 1 because the AMI identifier is not valid in that region. The company wants to preserve the custom image and make the smallest operational change. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Rebuild the custom image manually in US West 1 and maintain a second independent template. Option B. Copy the custom AMI to US West 1. Update the regional template parameter or mapping with the copied AMI ID and launch the stack again. Option C. Replace the custom image in both regions with an unrelated AWS-provided AMI. Option D. Deploy the Western environment manually outside CloudFormation. The correct answer is B. Copy the custom AMI to US West 1, update the regional template parameter or mapping with the copied AMI ID, and launch the stack again. Here is why. AMI IDs are region-specific. Copying the image creates a valid regional AMI while preserving the custom software and continuing to deploy through CloudFormation. Why are the other options not correct? Rebuilding and maintaining another template creates more operational work. C. Replacing the custom image can remove required application configuration. D. Manual deployment abandons the existing infrastructure as code workflow. Exam tip. Treat AMI IDs as regional values and supply the appropriate ID through template parameters, mappings, or another configuration source. Question number 85. Several Lambda functions depend on the same internally developed libraries. The team wants one reusable, versioned package that can be updated independently and attached to each function with minimal code changes. Which solution requires the least development effort? Option A. Mount an Amazon EFS file system containing the libraries from every function. Option B. Build and maintain one custom container base image for all functions. Option C. Publish the libraries to code artifact and add package installation logic to every deployment. Option D. Package the libraries in a versioned Lambda layer and attach the layer to each function. The correct answer is D. Package the libraries in a versioned Lambda layer and attach the layer to each function. Here is why. Lambda layers provide reusable, independently versioned dependency packages that multiple functions can reference. Why are the other options not correct? A. EFS requires VPC and mount configuration and is excessive for packaged libraries. B. Container images require a different packaging and maintenance workflow. C. Code artifact stores packages, but each function still needs dependency installation or bundling logic. Exam tip. Use Lambda layers to share and version common libraries across zip-based functions. Question number 86. IAM policies already ensure that each tenant can read only its own S3 objects. Compliance. Requirement now mandates TLS for every request to the bucket, regardless of the requesting principal. Which control enforces this requirement centrally? Option A. Add an explicit deny to the bucket policy when AWS secure transport is false. Option B. Deny requests when the S3 XAM's ACL value is public read. Option C. Require users to access the bucket through an AWS SDK. Option D. Allow requests only when S3 XAM's ACL is bucket owner read. The correct answer is A. Add an explicit deny to the bucket policy when AWS secure transport is false. Here is why. The bucket-level explicit denial rejects non-TLS-S3 requests for every principal, even when another IAM policy otherwise permits the action. Why are the other options not correct? B. The ACL condition controls object ACL values, not transport encryption. C. AWS SDK usage does not itself enforce TLS at the bucket authorization layer. D. Bucket owner read is an ACL value and does not require encrypted transport. Exam tip. Enforce HTTPS for S3 with a bucket policy deny using AWS secure transport equals false. Question number 87. An application load balancer routes production traffic to an auto-scaling target group. The team creates a second auto-scaling group and target group for a beta release. Only automated test requests that include a cookie named release with the value beta should be sent to the beta targets. Which solution implements the test routing with the least effort? Option A. Create another ALB and DNS record for the beta environment and change the test system to use the new hostname. Option B. Put CloudFront and Lambda at edge in front of a second ALB to select individual beta requests. Option C. Add an ALB listener rule that matches the beta cookie in the cookie HTTP header and forwards matching requests to the beta target group. Configure the tests to send the cookie. Option D. Add a CloudFront Lambda at edge function solely to inject the cookie before the existing LB evaluates the listener rule. The correct answer is C. Add an ALB listener rule that matches the beta cookie in the cookie HTTP header and forwards matching requests to the beta target group. Configure the tests to send the cookie. Here is why. The existing ALB can perform content-based routing and send only marked test requests to the beta target group without another load balancer or edge service. Why are the other options not correct? A second ALB and DNS name add unnecessary resources and management. B. CloudFront and Lambda at edge add substantial components for routing the test requests. D. Test code can send the cookie directly, so an edge function only to inject it is unnecessary. Exam tip. Use ALB listener conditions for low overhead host, path, header, query, method, or source-based request routing. Question number 88. An application on EC2 receives access denied when it requests objects from an S3 bucket. The instances use an attached IAM role. The team needs to inspect the two policy locations that can directly allow or deny this data access. Which two checks should the team perform? Choose 2. Option A. Review the permissions policy attached to the EC2 instance role. Option B. Review the S3 lifecycle configuration for permission statements. Option C. Review an IAM user policy supposedly attached to the EC2 instances. Option D. Review the S3 bucket policy for applicable allows or explicit denies. E. Review the EC2 security groups for an S3 object-level authorization rule. The correct answer is A. Review the permissions policy attached to the EC2 instance role. D. Review the S3 bucket policy for applicable allows or explicit denies. Here is why. S3 authorization can depend on the instance role's identity policy and the bucket's resource policy, including explicit denies in either applicable policy set. Why are the other options not correct? B. Lifecycle configuration manages object transitions and expiration, not request authorization. C. IAM users are not attached to EC2 instances. Applications use the instance profile role. E. Security groups control network traffic and do not grant S3 object permissions or produce S3 access denied authorization decisions. Exam tip. For EC2 to S3 access denied, inspect the instance role policy and relevant S3 bucket or access point policies. Question number 89. A highly available Python application runs across multiple EC2 instances. Developers want to inspect all application logs from one service without signing in to each server, and they want to avoid redesigning the application. Which solution requires the fewest changes? Option A. Consolidate the application onto one larger EC2 instance. Option B. Install the CloudWatch agent on every instance and configure it to send the application log files to CloudWatch logs. Option C. Rewrite the application as Lambda functions so logging occurs in CloudWatch logs. Option D. Deploy and administer an OpenSearch, Logstash, and dashboard-based logging stack. The correct answer is B. Install the CloudWatch agent on every instance and configure it to send the application log files to CloudWatch logs. Here is why. The agent centralizes existing log files from all EC2 instances in CloudWatch logs with minimal application changes. Why are the other options not correct? Consolidating to one instance removes high availability. C. Rewriting for Lambda is a major architecture change. D. A self-managed log analytics stack requires significantly more deployment and operations work. Exam tip. Use the CloudWatch agent to collect existing application and system logs from EC2 or on-premises servers. Question number 90. An S3 bucket is configured to deliver events to Amazon EventBridge. An existing Lambda function must run whenever a new object whose key ends in .csv is created. Which two steps complete the integration? Choose 2. Option A. Add an S3 lifecycle rule that invokes the function for new CSV objects. Option B. Create an EventBridge rule that matches S3 object created events and the .csv suffix. Option C. Schedule a second Lambda function to scan the bucket every 5 minutes. Option D. Configure the existing Lambda function as the EventBridge rule target and permit EventBridge to invoke it. E. Create a new Lambda function that periodically lists recently added objects. The correct answer is B. Create an EventBridge rule that matches S3 object created events and the .csv suffix. D. Configure the existing Lambda function as the EventBridge rule target and permit EventBridge to invoke it. Here is why. The rule selects matching S3 events, and the target plus Lambda permission allows EventBridge to invoke the existing processor. Why are the other options not correct? Lifecycle rules do not invoke Lambda for object creation. C and E. Scheduled bucket scans add delay and unnecessary code. Exam tip. For S3 through EventBridge, enable bucket delivery, match the event, and configure the target permission. Question number 91. A reusable cloud formation template must insert the region of the current stack deployment. into resource properties without asking the operator to provide the value. Which approach has the least operational overhead? Option A. Define a required input parameter for the deployment region. Option B. Read a region value from an AWS Systems Manager parameter store parameter. Option C. Reference the AWS region pseudo-parameter in the template. Option D. Parse the region from AWS stack ID by using fn split. The correct answer is C. Reference the AWS region pseudo-parameter in the template. Here is why. AWS region resolves automatically to the region in which CloudFormation creates the stack, so no operator input or external lookup is required. Why are the other options not correct? A required parameter adds unnecessary deployment input. B. Parameter store adds a separately managed configuration value. D. Parsing AWS stack ID is indirect and more complex than the dedicated pseudo-parameter. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation pseudo-parameters for deployment contexts such as account, region, stack ID, and partition. Question number 92. A QA-IAM group must invoke hundreds of Lambda function URLs. The URLs must require signed AWS requests rather than anonymous public access. Which configuration is complete? Option A. Configure each URL with none authentication and attach an identity policy to the group. Option B. Configure each URL with AWS_IAM authentication and grant the QA group both. Lambda. Invoke function URL and Lambda. Invoke function for the required functions. Option C. Configure each URL with AWS_IAM authentication and grant only. Lambda. Invoke function URL. Option D. Configure each URL with none authentication and add the IAM group ARN as a principal in a Lambda resource policy. The correct answer is B. Configure each URL with AWS_IAM authentication and grant the QA group both Lambda. Invoke function URL and Lambda. Invoke function for the required functions. Here is why. AWS_IAM requires SIGV4 authentication, and current function URL authorization requires both invocation permissions for the caller. Why are the other options not correct? A and D. None authentication allows anonymous access. C. It omits Lambda. Invoke function and is incomplete. Exam tip. IAM authenticated function URLs require signed requests and the complete Lambda invocation permission set. Question number 93. A document service already writes millions of records to DynamoDB. New and modified items must trigger near real-time processing, and the team wants to avoid changing the existing write path. Which implementation requires the fewest application changes? Option A. Process each document synchronously after the application completes its DynamoDB write. Option B. Run an hourly EC2 cron task that searches the table for recently changed records. Option C. Enable DynamoDB streams and configure a Lambda event source mapping to process the change records. Option D. Modify every writer to publish an event bridge event after each successful table update. The correct answer is C. Enable DynamoDB streams and configure a Lambda event source mapping to process the change records. Here is why. DynamoDB streams captures item-level inserts and updates, and Lambda can process the stream in near real-time without changing the existing write code. Why are the other options not correct? Synchronous processing adds latency and tightly couples the current write path. B. Hourly polling is not near real-time and requires server management. D. Publishing event bridge events requires every writer to be changed. Exam tip. Use DynamoDB streams when application logic must react to table changes without modifying existing writers. Question number 94. An application on Amazon EC2 connects to an RDS for Microsoft SQL Server database. Security. Policy requires the database password to be replaced at least once every 7 days with minimal custom credential management code. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Store the password as a parameter store secure string and rotate only the KMS key that Encrypts the parameter. Option B. Store the database credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure automatic rotation. To run daily. Option C. Enable IAM database authentication for the SQL Server instance and rotate a database. Password separately. Option D. Place the credentials in EC2 user data and expose them to the application as environment variables. The correct answer is B. Store the database credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure automatic rotation to run daily. Here is why. Secrets Manager securely stores database credentials and supports managed rotation schedules that satisfy the weekly requirement. Why are the other options not correct? Rotating the KMS key does not change the database password. C. RDS for SQL Server does not use the stated IAM database authentication workflow. D. User data and environment variables do not provide secure managed rotation. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager when automatic database credential rotation is a decisive requirement. Question number 95. A WebSocket API uses an HTTP backend. The backend must record when a client repeatedly opens and closes connections, and an administrator must be able to terminate an active connection. Which two changes provide these capabilities? Choose two. Option A. Replace the WebSocket API with an HTTP API. Option B. Integrate backend logic with the $connect and $disconnect routes. Option C. Store a client status value in Elastic Cache without adding connection lifecycle routes. Option D. Use the API Gateway Management API callback endpoint to delete the connection. E. Replace the WebSocket API with a REST API. The correct answer is B. Integrate backend logic with the $connect and $disconnect routes. D. Use the API Gateway Management API callback endpoint to delete the connection. Here is why. The lifecycle routes expose connection and disconnection events for tracking, and the Management API delete connection operation lets the backend terminate a client. Why are the other options not correct? A. HTTP APIs do not replace WebSocket lifecycle capabilities. C. A cache can hold state but does not generate lifecycle events or disconnect clients. E. REST APIs do not provide the persistent WebSocket connection model. Exam tip. Track WebSocket clients through $connect and $disconnect, and manage active connections through the @connections API. Question number 96. A developer wants the team to review source code, retain its complete history, and track groups of related changes across multiple versions. Which AWS service provides the required managed Git repository? Option A. Amazon S3. Option B. AWS Cloud 9. Option C. AWS Code Build. Option D. AWS Code Commit. The correct answer is D. AWS Code Commit. Here is why. Code Commit is a managed Git source control service that retains repository history, branches, commits, and grouped code changes for team collaboration. Why are the other options not correct? S3 provides object versions but not native Git workflows and commit history. B. Cloud 9 is a development environment rather than a long-term source repository. C. Code Build compiles and tests source but does not host Git repositories. Exam tip. Code Commit stores Git source. Code Build runs builds and tests. Code Deploy performs deployments. Question number 97. A versioned Lambda function queries an Aurora PostgreSQL database for a production website. Database credentials rotate every 14 days, and old published function versions must always retrieve the current credentials without being redeployed. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Store the credentials in Lambda environment variables and update each function configuration after every rotation. Option B. Store the credentials in parameter store and enable native automatic database password rotation on the parameter. Option C. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager, enable rotation, and retrieve the secret at runtime from the function. Option D. Embed the credentials in the source package and publish a new function version after each change. The correct answer is C. Store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager, enable rotation, and retrieve the secret at runtime from the function. Here is why. Runtime retrieval decouples the secret from immutable Lambda versions, so old versions automatically use the newest rotated credential. Why are the other options not correct? Updating environment variables changes function configuration and does not automatically update every published version. B. Parameter store does not provide the stated managed database secret rotation feature. D. Embedded credentials require repackaging and redeployment after every rotation. Exam tip. Retrieve rotating secrets at runtime instead of embedding them in immutable function code or versions. Question number 98. An application has completed the canonical request, string to sign, and signing key steps for an AWS signature version 4 request. Which two locations can carry the resulting signature? Choose 2. Option A, the HTTP authorization header. Option B, a browser session cookie. Option C, an HTTP header named authentication. Option D, the HTTP www authenticate header. E, the exam signature query parameter. The correct answer is A, the HTTP authorization header. E, the exam signature query parameter. Here is why. SigV4 supports header-based authentication through authorization and query string authentication for pre-signed requests through exam signature. Why are the other options not correct? B, session cookies are not a SigV4 signature location. C, authentication is not the SigV4 authorization header name. D, www authenticate is a response challenge header, not a request signature field. Exam tip. SigV4 signatures are carried in the authorization header or in the query string for pre-signed requests. Question number 99. A code pipeline workflow deploys RDS instances through CloudFormation. Each deployment must generate a database administrator password automatically, retain it securely, and reference it from the template with the least custom development. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Generate a password in code build, pass it as a noEchoStack parameter, and use the parameter as the database password. Option B. Define an AWS Secrets Manager secret resource with generate secret string and use a Secrets Manager dynamic reference for the database password. Option C. Create a Lambda-backed custom resource that returns the generated password directly and read the value with fn, get-att. Option D. Create a password-generating custom resource, copy its return value into a secrets manager secret, and then reference that secret. The correct answer is B. Define an AWS Secrets Manager secret resource with generate secret string and use a Secrets Manager dynamic reference for the database password. Here is why. CloudFormation can generate and store the password natively in Secrets Manager and resolve it without exposing the value or requiring custom code. Why are the other options not correct? noEcho masks displays, but the pipeline still handles the plaintext parameter. C. Returning a password from a custom resource can expose it and adds Lambda code. D. The custom generator is unnecessary because the Secrets Manager resource can generate the value directly. Exam tip. Use generate secret string plus a Secrets Manager dynamic reference for CloudFormation managed database passwords. Question number 100. A media portal stores large objects in Amazon S3. Users search object metadata before choosing a file to download. The metadata index must provide single-digit millisecond response times at scale. Which service should store the index? Option A. Amazon RDS. Option B. AWS Lambda. Option C. Amazon EC2. Option D. Amazon DynamoDB. The correct answer is D. Amazon DynamoDB. Here is why. DynamoDB provides managed key value and document storage with single-digit millisecond performance suitable for a scalable metadata index. Why are the other options not correct? RDS adds relational database administration and scaling overhead for this key-based metadata lookup. B. Lambda is compute, not a persistent metadata index. C. EC2 is compute infrastructure and would require a self-managed database. Exam tip. Store large objects in South3 and place frequently queried object metadata in a low-latency database such as DynamoDB. Question number 101. An AWS SAM stack contains an S3 origin, a CloudFront distribution, and several Lambda functions. One published function version is associated with the distribution as a Lambda at edge function. The stack is deployed in EU, Central 1 and fails during creation. What is a likely cause? Option A. The Lambda at edge function must be created in US East 1. Option B. CloudFront distributions can be provisioned only from stacks in US East 1. Option C. AWS SAM permits only one Lambda function in a template. Option D. An S3 origin and CloudFront distribution cannot be defined by resources in the same region. The correct answer is A. The Lambda at edge function must be created in US East 1. Here is why. Lambda functions and published versions associated with CloudFront as Lambda at edge functions must reside in the US East and Virginia region. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudFront is global, and its distribution resource is not restricted to a US East 1 only stack. C. AWS SAM templates can define multiple Lambda functions. DS3 can be used as the CloudFront origin in the same infrastructure deployment. Exam tip. Create Lambda at edge functions in US East 1 and associate a published function version, not $latest. Question number 102. An application caches database records in Elastic Cache. A real-time operations dashboard must find each newly written value in the cache immediately after the application updates. The database. Which cache population strategy is appropriate? Option A. Lazy loading. Option B. Write-through caching. Option C. Read-through caching. Option D. Write-behind caching. The correct answer is B. Write-through caching. Here is why. Write-through logic updates the cache as data is written, keeping newly written values immediately available to a real-time dashboard. Why are the other options not correct? Lazy loading populates data only after a cache miss on a read. C. Read-through also loads data in response to reads rather than every database write. D. Write-behind delays persistence and changes the database write path. Exam tip. Use write-through when the cache must be populated on writes. Use lazy loading when data can be cached only after a miss. Question number 103. A zip-based Lambda function requires a 100 megabytes third-party library. The dependency should be available in the execution environment while remaining separate from the functions. Application package. The team wants the lowest overhead solution. Which approach meets these requirements? Option A. Copy the library into /tmp while deploying the function package. Option B. Store the files on Amazon EFS. Attach the function to AVPC and mount the file system. Option C. Publish the library as a Lambda layer and attach the layer to the function. Option D. Upload the files to S3 and mount the bucket as a Lambda file system directory. The correct answer is C. Publish the library as a Lambda layer and attach the layer to the function. Here is why. A layer separates reusable dependencies from application code and makes them available under the Lambda runtime without EFS infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? A /tmp is runtime ephemeral storage and is not populated during package deployment. B. EFS requires VPC, access point, mount, and file system management. D. Lambda does not mount an ordinary S3 bucket as a native package directory. Exam tip. Use Lambda layers for reusable zip-based dependencies that fit within Lambda's combined unzipped package quota. Question number 104. A production Elastic Beanstalk environment runs a Node.js application on 4 load-balanced instances. The The team must test new code on a newer platform version and then release it, without interrupting production traffic. Which deployment method meets the requirement? Option A. Deploy all code to the current environment at once and restore the previous version if testing fails. Option B. Use a rolling deployment to update subsets of the existing instances while testing. Option C. Perform an immutable application update in the existing environment without first testing the new platform version separately. Option D. Clone the environment onto the newer platform, deploy and test the code, and swap the environment URLs after validation. The correct answer is D. Clone the environment onto the newer platform, deploy and test the code, and swap the environment URLs after validation. Here is why. The cloned environment provides an isolated blue/green target for platform and code testing, and the URL swap redirects traffic with no application downtime. Why are the other options not correct? All-at-once deployment causes downtime. B. Rolling deployment reduces serving capacity and does not provide an isolated full platform test environment. C. Immutable deployment protects the current instances but does not offer the same pre-release environment and URL swap workflow. Exam tip. For Elastic Beanstalk platform upgrades with pre-production testing and zero downtime, clone the environment and swap names. Question number 105. A Lambda-backed API connects directly to an RDS for MySQL instance. Unpredictable traffic. Spikes produce HTTP 500 responses and database, too many connections errors. Although CPU and memory remain available, the database cannot be restarted outside maintenance windows. Which solution makes the application more resilient? Option A. Create an RDS proxy and update the Lambda connection endpoint to use the proxy. Option B. Lower the database virtual CPU count and increase max_connections. Option C. Use a CloudWatch alarm to change the DB instance class whenever connections exceed a fixed threshold. Option D. Run an event bridge action that modifies max_connections whenever CPU exceeds 75%. The correct answer is A. Create an RDS proxy and update the Lambda connection endpoint to use the proxy. Here is why. RDS proxy pools and reuses database connections across bursty Lambda invocations, reducing connection exhaustion without restarting the database. Why are the other options not correct? B. Reducing compute while increasing connection limits can worsen resource pressure and requires configuration changes. C. A CloudWatch alarm cannot directly and safely resize the database without custom automation and disruption. D. CPU utilization does not directly represent connection exhaustion, and changing the parameter can require maintenance. Exam tip. Use RDS proxy to protect relational databases from connection storms generated by highly concurrent Lambda functions. Question number 106. A utility receives 1 telemetry reading per minute from every customer site. Customers need low-latency access to the latest and historical readings by site and time. The data volume will grow rapidly, and the database must scale without planned downtime at low operational cost. Which design best meets these requirements? Option A. Store readings in RDS and create relational indexes on site ID and timestamp. Option B. Store readings in S3 partitions and query them on demand with Athena. Option C. Store readings in DynamoDB with site ID as the partition key and timestamp as the sort key. Option D. Store all readings in an elastic cache sorted set and use it as the durable system of record. The correct answer is C. Store readings in DynamoDB with site ID as the partition key and timestamp as the sort key. Here is why. The composite key supports efficient per-site time range queries, while DynamoDB scales horizontally without database downtime or server management. Why are the other options not correct? A. RDS scaling and high-volume time series growth require more capacity planning and administration. B. Athena over S3 is appropriate for analytics but not low-latency on-demand reads. D. Elastic cache is not the appropriate durable system of record for all historical readings. Exam tip. Model DynamoDB keys around access patterns. Use the entity ID as partition key and time as sort key for time-ordered queries. Question number 107. A code pipeline already retrieves application source from a selected GitHub branch. The team now needs the pipeline to execute the repository's unit test commands after the source action with minimal additional components. Which two steps should the developer take? Choose two. Option A. Create a code deploy project and place test commands in a build spec file. Option B. Create a code build project whose build spec contains the build and unit test commands. Option C. Create a code commit project and configure its build spec with the test commands. Option D. Add a stage after the source stage and configure a code build action that consumes the source artifact. E. Add the new action to the source stage and configure it to consume a build artifact. The correct answer is B. Create a code build project whose build spec contains the build and unit test commands. D. Add a stage after the source stage and configure a code build action that consumes the source artifact. Here is why. Code build runs the repository's test commands, and the separate post-source pipeline stage receives the source artifact and fails the workflow when tests fail. Why are the other options not correct? Code deploy deploys revisions and does not execute build spec-based unit tests. C. Code commit hosts source and is not a build project. E. The test action belongs after source and must consume the source artifact, not a non-existent build artifact. Exam tip. Code pipeline orchestrates stages, while code build executes build spec commands for compilation and testing. Question number 108. An application must encrypt hundreds of large video files before storage. Every video requires a unique plaintext data encryption key, and the application must retain the encrypted form of that key for later decryption. Which implementation follows the AWS KMS envelope encryption pattern? Option A. Call generate data key, encrypt the video locally with the plaintext data key, and store the ciphertext video with the encrypted data key. Option B. Generate one symmetric key with a local cryptography library and reuse it for every video. Option C. Send each entire video to the KMS Encrypt API and store the response. Option D. Upload the plaintext video by using S3 server-side encryption. The correct answer is A. Call generate data key, encrypt the video locally with the plaintext data key, and store the ciphertext video with the encrypted data key. Here is why. Generate data key returns a unique plaintext data key and its KMS encrypted copy, enabling efficient envelope encryption of large application data. Why are the other options not correct? B. Reusing one unmanaged key does not meet the unique key requirement or provide managed key protection. C. KMS encrypt is intended for small plaintext values, not large video files. D. Server-side encryption occurs after upload and does not satisfy application-side encryption. Exam tip. Use KMS data keys for envelope encryption. Encrypt data locally and store the encrypted data key beside the ciphertext. Question number 109. An application uses an HTTP and HTTPS load balancer and needs the backend to read the original client IP address from each request. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Use a network load balancer and read an X-forwarded for header. Option B. Use an application load balancer and depend only on instance ID target registration. Option C. Use an application load balancer and read the X-forwarded for header. Option D. Use a network load balancer and require proxy protocol v2 for an HTTP listener. The correct answer is C. Use an application load balancer and read the X-forwarded for header. Here is why. An ALB terminates HTTP or HTTPS and adds the originating client IP address to the X-forwarded for request header. Why are the other options not correct? A. An NLB operates at layer 4 and does not add the HTTP X-forwarded for header. B. Target registration type does not expose the original client IP through an HTTP header. D. Proxy protocol is an NLB transport feature and is not the direct HTTP header solution requested. Exam tip. For HTTP applications behind an ALB, read X-forwarded for to identify the original client address. Question number 110. healthcare Lambda function writes regulated temporary data to /TMP. In addition to Lambda's default at-rest protection, the company requires application-level encryption with a customer-controlled KMS key before the bytes are written. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A. Attach an encrypted EBS volume to the Lambda function. Option B. Generate an unmanaged OpenSSL key during every cold start and discard the key later. Option C. Permit the execution role to use a customer-managed KMS key, called Generate Data Key, and encrypt the temporary data with the plaintext data key before writing to /TMP. Option D. Send every encryption request to an on-premises HSM. The correct answer is C. Permit the execution role to use a customer-managed KMS key, called Generate Data Key, and encrypt the temporary data with the plaintext data key before writing to /TMP. Here is why. Envelope encryption protects the bytes before storage and keeps key control with the customer-managed KMS key. Why are the other options not correct? Lambda cannot attach EBS volumes. B. An unmanaged ephemeral key lacks controlled recovery and policy management. D. An on-premises HSM adds unnecessary latency and infrastructure. Exam tip. Use KMS data keys for application-level encryption of data larger than direct KMS payload limits. Question number 111. Software running on an EC2 instance must discover the instance's current public IP version 4 address without calling an external address discovery service. Which source should the application query? Option A. The operating system hosts file. Option B. The public IP version 4 category in the EC2 instance metadata service. Option C. The instance user data document. Option D. The AMI metadata identifier. The correct answer is B. The public IP version 4 category in the EC2 instance metadata service. Here is why. EC2 instance metadata exposes instance-specific networking attributes, including the public IP version 4 address when one is assigned. Why are the other options not correct? The host file does not reliably contain the instance's current public address. C. User data contains launch time input supplied by the user, not dynamic instance networking metadata. D. AMI metadata identifies the source image rather than the instance public IP. Exam tip. Use IMDS-v2 to retrieve instance-specific metadata securely from software running on EC2. Question number 112. A developer creates a Cloud Watchlogs metric filter to count exception messages that already exist in a log group. The new metric initially has no data points for those older messages. Why does this occur? Option A. Metric filters require the log group to be streamed to OpenSearch first. Option B. Metric filters work only after log data is exported to S3. Option C. A Cloud Watchlogs interface endpoint must exist before filtering can begin. Option D. A metric filter evaluates log events that are ingested after the filter is created and does not process historical events. The correct answer is D. A metric filter evaluates log events that are ingested after the filter is created and does not process historical events. Here is why. Cloud Watchlogs metric filters publish metric values only for new matching log events that arrive after the filter exists. Why are the other options not correct? OpenSearch streaming is not required for metric filters. B. S3 export is unrelated to metric filter evaluation. C. A VPC endpoint affects private connectivity, not whether historical events are reprocessed. Exam tip. Cloud Watchlogs metric filters are not retroactive. Create them before the events you need to count. Question number 113. An ECS blue/green deployment managed by CodeDeploy must shift 10% of production traffic to the replacement task set, wait 15 minutes, and then shift the remaining 90%. Which predefined deployment configuration provides this behavior? Option A. CodeDeploy default.ECS linear 10% every 1 minute. Option B. CodeDeploy default.ECS canary 10% 15 minutes. Option C. CodeDeploy default.lambda canary 10% 15 minutes. Option D. Code deploy default.lambda canary 10% 5 minutes. The correct answer is B. Code deploy default.ECS canary 10% 15 minutes. Here is why. This predefined ECS canary configuration shifts 10% of traffic first and moves the remaining 90% after a 15-minute interval. Why are the other options not correct? The ECS linear configuration moves traffic in repeated equal increments. C. Lambda deployment configurations apply to Lambda functions, not ECS task sets. D. It is a Lambda configuration with a 5-minute interval. Exam tip. Match the code deploy configuration prefix to the compute platform and the name to the required canary or linear timing. Question number 114. A team is releasing a Ruby web application and wants AWS to provision the runtime environment, deploy the code, monitor health, and scale capacity without requiring the developers to manage the underlying infrastructure directly. Which service is the best fit? Option A. AWS Elastic Beanstalk. Option B. AWS Cloud Formation. Option C. AWS Code Deploy. Option D. AWS OpsWorks. The correct answer is A. AWS Elastic Beanstalk. Here is why. Elastic Beanstalk deploys supported application platforms and manages capacity provisioning, load balancing, scaling, and health monitoring. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudFormation defines infrastructure, but does not provide the same managed application platform workflow by itself. C. Code Deploy automates application deployment, but does not provision and scale the full environment. D. OpsWorks is configuration management and requires more infrastructure knowledge. Exam tip. Use Elastic Beanstalk when developers want a managed application platform while retaining access to the underlying AWS resources. Question number 115. A production API gateway API invokes a Lambda function. A developer fixes a defect and needs an isolated API stage for testing. The tested function code must also be immutable so that another developer cannot overwrite it during the test cycle. Which two actions meet these requirements with the least effort? Choose two. Option A. Point an alias to $latest after editing the code. Option B. Create a separate API gateway API and reproduce all resources and methods manually. Option C. Publish the corrected function as a new version and point a hotfix alias to that version. Option D. Add another method to the existing production stage and redeploy that stage. E. Update the integration to reference the hotfix alias and deploy the existing API to a new hotfix stage. The correct answer is C. Publish the corrected function as a new version and point a hotfix alias to that version. E. Update the integration to reference the hotfix alias and deploy the existing API to a new hotfix stage. Here is why. A published Lambda version is immutable, the alias provides a stable target, and the separate API stage creates an isolated endpoint for testing. Why are the other options not correct? $latest is mutable and can be overwritten during testing. B. Rebuilding a second API creates unnecessary development work. D. Modifying the production stage does not create an isolated development environment. Exam tip. Combine immutable Lambda versions and aliases with separate API gateway stages for safe environment-specific testing. Question number 116. A mobile application's REST API has a new deployment that should initially receive only a small percentage of production requests. The rollout must use an API gateway native feature and require minimal additional infrastructure. Which solution is simplest? Option A. Create another API and divide DNS traffic with a Route 53 weighted policy. Option B. Configure an API gateway canary release and set the canary traffic percentage in the stage settings. Option C. Replace the production deployment during the lowest traffic period. Option D. Create only a CloudWatch alarm that reacts to elevated HTTP 500 responses. The correct answer is B. Configure an API gateway canary release and set the canary traffic percentage in the stage settings. Here is why. API gateway canary settings route a controlled percentage of stage traffic to the new deployment without a second API or DNS configuration. Why are the other options not correct? A second API and Route 53 add unnecessary infrastructure. C. A low traffic release is not a percentage-based controlled rollout. D. An alarm can detect problems but does not route traffic to the new version. Exam tip. Use API gateway stage canaries for gradual REST API deployment testing. Question number 117. A DynamoDB table stores short-lived web sessions. Each item contains the time after which the session is no longer needed, and the team wants DynamoDB to remove expired records automatically. What is the simplest implementation? Option A. Create a new session table each day and delete the previous table. Option B. Schedule an EC2 script that scans for and deletes old sessions. Option C. Add an attribute named item expiration but do not configure any table feature. Option D. Store an epic expiration value in an attribute and enable DynamoDB time to live for that attribute. The correct answer is D. Store an epic expiration value in an attribute and enable DynamoDB time to live for that attribute. Here is why. DynamoDB TTL automatically removes expired items asynchronously based on the configured numeric epic time attribute. Why are the other options not correct? Daily table replacement creates unnecessary data management work. B. A scheduled deletion script requires compute, scanning, and maintenance. C. The attribute name alone has no effect until TTL is enabled for it. Exam tip. DynamoDB TTL requires a table-level TTL configuration that names an attribute containing expiration time in Unix epic seconds. Question number 118. A migrated web tier runs on multiple interchangeable instances and must share session state through a highly scalable, low-latency service. The session store should remain independent of any individual application instance. Which option is best? Option A. Enable load balancer session stickiness and keep sessions in instance memory. Option B. Store session objects in CloudFront. Option C. Use a highly available Amazon Elastic Cache deployment as the shared session store. Option D. Store every session as an S3 object and retrieve it for each request. The correct answer is C. Use a highly available Amazon Elastic Cache deployment as the shared session store. Here is why. Elastic Cache provides low-latency shared state independent of web instances and can be configured for replication and automatic failover. Why are the other options not correct? Sticky sessions bind users to instances and can lose state when an instance fails. B. CloudFront caches content at edge locations and is not an application session database. D. S3 is durable, but is not optimized for low-latency per-request session access. Exam tip. Keep horizontally scaled web tiers stateless by storing sessions in a shared, low-latency data service. Question number 119. A site-to-site VPN uses BGP to reach a VPC. Traffic reaches an EC2 instance in one subnet, but not an instance in another subnet of the same VPC. The developer needs records showing whether packets are accepted or rejected at network interfaces in the second subnet. Which logging feature should be used? Option A. VPC flow logs. Option B. AWS CloudTrail logs. Option C. BGP protocol logs. Option D. VPN activity logs. The correct answer is A. VPC flow logs. Here is why. VPC flow logs record accepted and rejected IP traffic for VPC network interfaces, subnets, or the VPC, and can show whether traffic reaches subnet B. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudTrail records AWS API activity rather than packet flows. C. BGP information describes route exchange, not per interface accepted or rejected traffic. D. VPN logs do not replace subnet or ENI flow records for this check. Exam tip. Use VPC flow logs for packet path evidence and CloudTrail for control plane API auditing. You have completed part 3 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.